because I am a chemistry professor and I went nuts when I saw your proposal, which is really on science in Harry Potter. And so we have a really nice hour for this. I'm going to try to be quiet and I'm going to let you guys go for it because I almost made you a whole panel with just back-to-back talks because you could have done it that way. So I'm going to mute myself and let you take it from here.
Awesome. Well, can everyone hear me? I think so. Yeah. Okay. Well, hi everyone. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you so much to the Harry Potter conference and Karen for inviting us and hosting. We're super excited to be here. So we're a panel of scientists of various different types, and we're here to discuss the science of the Harry Potter universe. So how we were thinking we would do it is we would each briefly talk about what interests us specifically. And then we can open up the floor to discussion where hopefully you guys can ask some questions, and we may not have any of the answers to those questions, but we'll try and hopefully we'll have a good conversation. Okay, so before we delve into it, I was thinking all the panelists could just quickly introduce themselves. So I'll go first. My name is Kate. My house is Ravenclaw. My pronouns are she, her, and for my science, I'm currently in cancer research, actually, specifically gliomas, but my educational background is in neuroscience and psychology, so that's mostly what I'm going to be focusing on today. And Ariel, if you want to go next.
Hi, I'm Ariel. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a Ravenclaw also. And I am studying social epidemiology and specifically gender, sexuality, and health. Andrew, you can go next.
Hi, I'm Andrew Stolman. I'm a professor at Occidental College. I study cognitive developmental psychology. My pronouns are he, him, and my house is Ravenclaw. Emily.
Hi, my name is Emily Greenwald. I am a PhD candidate at Stanford. My house is Ravenclaw, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. And I am studying genetics, but also have backgrounds in virology. Oh, and Emmy can go next.
Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Alrighty, so hey everyone, my name is Emma Hayashi, and I am the lone Hufflepuff on this panel, but I am a scientist, I promise you. I offer the softer side of science. I'm the veterinarian, answering any animal, domestic pet questions. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I'm also getting my PhD in neuroscience, but I will leave the neuroscience questions to wiser minds than myself for today. All right, I guess we'll switch to Logan.
Hey everybody, I'm Logan Park, he, him, and I thank Godric every day that I'm a Gryffindor. I'm a forestry and human ecologist person, so out of Southern Illinois University, I study how muggles and wizards alike think about and interact with, and in some cases impact the beautiful natural world around us. Also, we have a quick panel-wide disclaimer. Here be dragons. This discussion might allude to nonfiction First Nations belief and culture, such as the Thunderbird. We're going to focus on diegetic, so in film and in book canon representation only out of respect. And, you know, this is going to be a pretty freewheeling conversation. So if animal welfare is a concern for you, we want to just kind of mention that as a potential trigger warning, maybe also climate anxiety. That's a thing for some people. And we're hopefully going to be super cognizant of trans rights relative to all the stuff that's going on with Harry Potter lately. And so whatever good self-care means for you with respect to this talk, do that thing. You're worth it. That's all I got.
I think that's all of us. So just to delve into it, maybe unsurprisingly, Harry Potter has managed to infiltrate many fields of academia, as it has in other parts of the world and culture. And there's quite a lot of actual legitimate scientific research out there on the topic, including, but not limited to, psychology. And this is actually Andrew's paper right here. Genetics and biology as well, zoology and environmental research, and even epidemiology and public health. So that's actually where we're going to start. So Ariel will kick us off.
Okay, so for my portion of this panel, I'll be presenting on magical epidemiology and specifically how epidemiology and public health function in the wizarding world, as well as how we may study Harry Potter and the fandom through an epidemiologic lens. Next slide, please. So to start, what is epidemiology? I think unfortunately we all have a bit more knowledge of what epidemiology is now than we did prior to 2020, but to give a bit more context than what we see on the news. So epidemiology as a field was founded by John Snow, not this John Snow, but this John Snow, whose work on the cholera outbreak in London in the 1850s pioneered modern public health research methods. So epidemiology is most commonly defined as the study of the distribution and determinants of health and disease within populations, so not within individuals, so that's an important distinction. And of course, this is so much more than infectious diseases. Epidemiologists study chronic disease, mental illness, the health effects of environmental pollutants, and so many more things, typically by collecting data on exposures and health outcomes, and then using statistics to examine the causal relationships between these variables. Next slide. So muggles are, of course, not the only ones who have to worry about getting sick. So what do we know about epidemiology and public health within the Wizarding World? Actually, we know very little. Of course, we know of St. Mungo's, the hospital, and we know about the hospital wing within Hogwarts. But both of these are institutions that really address individual level health, not public health. So who or what is helping to control and prevent the spread of diseases at the population level within the Wizarding World? Questions that I think would be really interesting to think about. Is there a department of magical epidemiology in the Ministry of Magic? What types of public health surveillance are they doing? Do they work to address health disparities, particularly among Muggle-borns and other groups experiencing social marginalization in the Wizarding World? And a broader question that I think is really interesting, do magical epidemiologists use statistics and the scientific method and causal reasoning, or do they have other more magical means of collecting and analyzing their data? Next slide. So of course, the big question when it comes to epidemiology is how is the Wizarding World dealing with COVID-19? We know from the text that witches and wizards can easily heal from any Muggle sickness or disease, and so that probably includes COVID. But then the question becomes, what are the global implications of this? So I imagine that there would be a non-trivial ethical debate surrounding the tensions between the International Statute of Secrecy and the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. Specifically, does the Wizarding World want to risk exposure to help the Muggle world in this crisis, or would that lead to a different kind of disaster for their world? Reading between the lines of the text reveals that historically the Wizarding World has mostly stayed out of Muggle world global politics and conflicts, and of course that's been rightfully critiqued by fans and Harry Potter scholars. So I would like to envision an alternative Wizarding World where that's no longer the case and they work with Muggles to solve important world problems. But of course I would love to hear your thoughts on this in the discussion. Next slide. So now to shift gears, I thought it would also be interesting to think about how we would study Harry Potter through an epidemiologic lens. And what I think would be really interesting is studying how the Harry Potter fandom influences the health and specifically the mental health of its members. So we know in social epidemiology that social group membership is related to health in numerous and complex ways. And social groups can, of course, include fandoms. So that means it is reasonable to hypothesize that the Harry Potter fandom has health-related implications. And specifically, we know that belonging to a social group can be protective against adverse mental health outcomes via things like social support, resources, and resilience. And anecdotally, we have all heard about how belonging to the Harry Potter fandom can have similar effects. And there's also been numerous narratives of how belonging to the Harry Potter fandom has been particularly meaningful to LGBTQ youth, providing a sort of safe and welcoming space, and specifically one that was built around a story defined by themes of love, acceptance, and diversity. Next slide. And so that brings me to my final slide, in which I want to address and explicitly condemn on health and social justice grounds J.K. Rowling's recent transphobia. This has, of course, been incredibly harmful to trans folks, both inside and outside of the Harry Potter fandom. We can click to the next part. And we also know from social epidemiological research that rhetoric like this contributes to a larger stigmatizing social environment for trans and gender diverse communities, and this has serious and direct health implications. And so it is really important as Harry Potter fans and scholars that we continue to condemn J.K. Rowling's comments and support the trans community. And that is the end of my part.
Thank you so much, Ariel. And yeah, I think we're all going to hopefully address, but we all condemn that J.K. Rowling's transphobia and support and love our trans and non-binary matches for who you are. And much of this research in my field, genetics, has focused on genetic counseling that is supportive of those communities. And a question that I get all the time as a geneticist and huge Harry Potter fan is, how do we explain wizard inheritance? So this is a cartoon image of DNA, and you can see it is double-stranded. So there's a red strand and a blue strand here, and they're connected through these lines, which we call bases. The bases that make up DNA are A, T, C, and G. And in some genes, there's regions of large numbers of repeats within the DNA. So the bases A, T, C, and G are put into groups of 3 that I'll refer to as a triplet. And these triplets can have large numbers of repeats in the DNA. And sometimes, like, repeats in genes lead to high numbers of repeats in genes above a certain threshold, let's say over 40, lead to weird, unique phenotypes. Usually this is a disease, but in our case, we can use this to explain Harry's magical abilities and the magical abilities of other wizards and witches in the wizarding world. And when you're below that threshold of 40, you can see we need to play Quidditch on the ground, and unfortunately, we are muggles. And this explains wizard and muggle families, because in most cases, beyond the threshold, being beyond the threshold of repeats is maintained, and below the threshold is maintained. However, there are some exceptions in the wizarding world, and they are supported by the genetics. So repeats lead to confusion in DNA replication. So the way that a new organism is formed is through 2 parent cells coming together, and the way a new parent cell is made is through DNA replication. And large numbers of repeats in the genome cause confusion in the DNA replication process. And one mechanism that this is taken care of is through a formation of a DNA loop. And so you see here, we have the red bottom strand has 10 repeats of our CAG nucleotide triplet, and the blue top strand has this loop over 40. And so this would be read as the 10, because this is not contributing to the way the gene would be read in its expression. And this, in the formation of a new cell, enzymatic activity is one mechanism by which that loop can actually be totally removed in forming a new organism. And then this results in an organism whose DNA is all below the threshold of 10, and they are a squid. However, the other case is muggle-borns, and let's use the same loop example. Like I said, this is one mechanism by which this can happen. And in this case, instead of removing the loop, a different enzymatic activity can open up the loop. And because the 2 DNA strands need to be complementary, the repeats on both strands will be expanded, and this leads to a muggle-born. And just as Hermione is obliviating her parents in this image here, I'm going to pass this off to Kate to talk about the magic of memory.
Thank you, Emily. So like Emily said, I'm particularly interested in the way that memory is portrayed in Harry Potter and how this can relate to our Muggle experience with memory, if at all. So really briefly, because of course everyone knows what memory is, but the scientific definition is the encoding, storage, and retrieval of information. So we break down memory in a few different ways, long-term memory versus short-term memory, or sometimes called working memory, which I think is fairly self-explanatory, and also implicit versus explicit memory, explicit being memory of facts and information, and implicit being memory of skills and procedures like how to tie your shoes. So the part of the brain that predominantly controls memory is the hippocampus. It's the small part here in this diagram in the limbic system. It consolidates information and stores it. The predominant brain cell type in this region is called pyramidal neurons, and so named for their pyramid-like shape. You can kind of see them in the diagram here. You can change the slide. Thank you. Great, so one of the major ways that memory plays a role in Harry Potter is, of course, in obliviation, where one wizard could remove a specific memory, like a memory of a person or a memory of certain information or event from another. And we would call this a form of amnesia. And amnesia can happen in muggles, of course, in a few different ways, including through brain damage, diseases like Alzheimer's or other dementias, or even disorders like PTSD. And there are two overarching categories of amnesia. One would be retrograde, meaning you lose past memories, and then also anterograde, where you're losing the ability to form new memories. So it seems like when someone is obliviated, they lose specific autobiographical memories or memories of certain events, while retaining knowledge of skills and also the ability to make new memories. So this would fall under the category of specific retrograde amnesia, and would be more similar, I think, to amnesia from brain damage rather than diseases like dementia. Of course, we know these spells can obviously go awry, as in the case of Lockhart, where he seems to have complete retrograde amnesia. He pretty much loses his whole past, and as a result, also his identity. He shows some signs also of not being able to hold on to new information, so it may be suggesting that he also has a little bit of an anterograde amnesia as well. So interestingly, even in the extreme case of Lockhart, he doesn't really seem to have significant issues in other types. So he can talk normally, his speech is normal, his motor control is fine, as far as we can see at least. So in terms of what obliviation is actually doing, my best guess would be that it's a small scale sort of brain damaging event, maybe creating like a hyper-specific lesion, probably on the hippocampus and not elsewhere, based on its lack of effect in other areas besides memory. You can skip to the next slide, thank you. So another way that memory features heavily is, of course, with the concept of pensives, where one person can take a memory and revisit it in detail and even show it to other people. Obviously, in the Muggle world, this technology is otherwise we would all, I'm sure. There is some interesting preliminary research on the topic, actually, like this one study here from some time ago, but researchers were able to train flatworms, these little guys, to scrunch up their bodies in response to bright light, which is impressive on its own, I think. But then when they took neural tissue from these trained flatworms and grafted them onto untrained worms, the new worms actually showed the same response despite never having been trained, which is interesting. And of course, flatworms are much more simplistic creatures than humans are, but it does suggest that, at least theoretically, memory transfer could maybe be possible from one organism to another via some sort of tissue transfer. So this could be one theory of how pensives work. Maybe it's some sort of magical small-scale tissue transfer of a specific type. And the last thing I'll say about this is that the way, sorry, I'm not quite done. Sorry, thanks. That wasn't clear. The last thing I'll say is that the way that memory is portrayed in pensives is not really like how we as Muggles experience memory. Memory in the pensives is shown to be extremely accurate, almost exact replications of the actual event, except of course when Slughorn purposefully messes with his own memory. But in reality, for us at least, memory is extremely fragile and often has holes. It also degrades really quickly and is extremely prone to suggestion, even to the point where in courtrooms, eyewitness testimony, which used to be considered pretty ironclad, is no longer really relied on heavily because we now know that it can be pretty wildly inaccurate, no matter how confident the witnesses might be. So I guess the question would be with pensives is it showing an edited version of each memory? Is it showing whatever the witch or wizard that puts it in remembers? Or is part of the magic of pensives that they're able to show a more accurate and detailed memory than the person themselves could produce? And I would guess the latter, because people seem to really treat the memories as highly reliable unless they're tampered with, but who knows? I think it's interesting to think about. Okay, now you can skip, sorry. Thanks. Oh yeah, so this isn't particularly memory related, although please tell me if you have any thoughts on the memory of Harry Potter. But since it's such a point of discussion recently, I wanted to briefly mention neuroscience research in general on gender identity. As Emily said earlier, there is some things out there. There's not a ton of research out there. And maybe there doesn't really need to be so much, since we don't necessarily need research to tell us who we are or to validate our existence or anything. But what is out there, like she was saying, is almost always gender affirming, at least that I've seen for myself. So for instance, this one study from a couple of years ago, young transgender individuals were given fMRI scans or brain activity scans, and it was found that brain activation patterns in these folks was more similar to the gender that they identified with rather than their biologically assigned sex. And also because they were young, at least my guess would be that it's less likely to be due to years of socialization, sorry, because many of them had just come out recently. They're quite young. So I would guess that this just means that this is how their brains naturally are. And I think that research like this can be important to talk about, if only because often I hear transphobic people sometimes try to use science as a way to invalidate the experience of trans folks or to really enforce the strict gender and sex binary. And that's just really not what research shows us. So I think that's important to note as well. But anyway, I just wanted to touch on that quickly since it's relevant nowadays. But we can now move on from neuroscience to the highly related field of cognitive psychology with Andrew.
Hello, I'm a cognitive psychologist, and as such, I study how people perceive and reason about the world, including fictional worlds, and including worlds that have magic. So there's something interesting about the portrayal of magic in fiction, which is that some magic is more difficult to perform than other magic. So for instance, at Hogwarts, students who are learning levitation spells, they learn to levitate feathers before moving on to heavier objects. When they learn to transfigure, they start with buttons before moving on to larger, more complex objects. You could think about this ordering in a couple of ways. One is that perhaps the creators of these magical worlds have their own ideas about what's difficult that feeds into the narrative structure, and readers just go along with it. Another possibility, though, is that we all share intuitions about the relative difficulty of magic, including the authors. And the fiction is just a reflection of those shared intuitions. So I've been doing some research that suggests the latter view is correct, that we have expectations about the causal structure of the world around us that we happen to apply to magical worlds as well. So in this research, the cover story for my subjects is that they are reviewing the curriculum at Hogwarts, and they want to include some new spells in the curriculum, and they have to decide whether the spell should be introduced at an introductory level or an advanced level. So the spells are presented in pairs. So one possible pair would be a spell for walking through a brick wall versus a spell for walking through a wooden wall. And they have to say, which would be introductory, which would be advanced. So in both of these cases, the same core principle is violated, that one solid can't pass through another. But there's a secondary consideration about the density of that solid. And from a logical point of view, we really shouldn't take into account that secondary consideration, because once you've suspended this principle that solids can't pass through one another, why should it matter what the solid is made of? But it does. People reliably say that it would be more difficult to learn a spell for walking through a brick wall. Next slide. So we find that this sense of ordering in terms of spell difficulty is general across lots of different concepts that might be violated by the spell across lots of different domains of causation. So for instance, we find with respect to biological causality, people think it would be harder to grow an extra eye than to grow an extra toe because an eye is more complex. Or in the psychological domain, people think it would be harder to teach a cow how to tap dance than to teach it how to skip, because tap dancing is a more complex procedure. And we find this not just across domains, but also across different ways of probing people's intuitions. So you might think if you had a forced choice between two spells, you're just going to go based on some secondary consideration because you have nothing else to do. But when we give people the option to say that they're both equally difficult, people don't tend to choose that option. They still prefer to order one over the other. People abide by these constraints when just rating the spells one by one for how difficult they are. They also abide by the constraints when they create their own spells. So if you ask them to create spells that would go into an introductory levitation course, an intermediate one, and an advanced one, they say for the introductory course, you learn how to levitate things that we lift all the time on our own, like pencils and forks. For an intermediate course, it's things we could still lift, but would be harder, like tables and chairs. And for an advanced course, it would be things that we can't even lift ourselves, like a car. So we find that these intuitions about magic difficulty hold across cultures. So we find the same effects for Chinese adults who ostensibly have been exposed to less Western fiction, so perhaps it's reflecting just a shared intuition. We also find the same thing for children. 4-year-olds show the same intuitions about spell difficulty as adults do. So all in all, we think that what's going on here is that a magic spell might sever one causal connection, but we continue to apply other forms of causal knowledge when thinking about the spell and its consequences. So let me then move now to Logan.
Okay, so let's talk about kind of 3 organizing principles of my field of research, and those will be cryptobiology, cryptozoology, and cryptoecology. And we're going to go around the wizarding world in about 7 slides. So here we go. Next slide, please. All right, so the whole idea with fantastic beasts and where to find them is it's kind of encoded these 3 different concepts into even just the title of the first movie of that sequence. So cryptobiology is going to be all about the individual characteristics of cryptoorganisms, like dragons. That was an Antipodean opali, and we can interrogate a lot of things about that, about its morphology, so its shape, its physiology, its living characteristics and processes, and also things like its behaviors. So, for example, we could have our conference organizer, Dr. Wendling, run an atomic emission spectra analysis on the Antipodean opali's very bright red flame. And for the exact same reason that we get different colors and different kinds of fireworks, magnesium, for example, burns bright white. We can, without destructively sampling the organism, try and figure out things like what kinds of maybe binary liquids are being secreted in the throat of this thing and then propelled out in a wildly reactive form. All right, next slide. So be thinking about questions about cryptozoology. So what happens when we combine a whole, a herd, a pack, a murder, let's call them a flight of dragons in, for example, Hebridean black dragon territory right off the western coast of Scotland. And there's a particular wizarding community that is devoted to their care and so forth. And what's involved in that? How many tons of fish does a healthy population versus one that is experiencing some island genetic and physiological effects, like depressed size in individuals based on the population's particular characteristics? And then kind of zooming out one layer from that, next slide, we'll talk about cryptoecology, which is considering those individuals and populations, and then all of the material and energy flows that happen and connect them all across our planet. So there's, if you go to the next slide, there's, we can think about how, if we think about what's the habitat like in Pennsylvania, where our conference is at least physically housed, for those of us who are not virtual. Next slide. We can fly across the Atlantic and wrestle with things like climate change and forcing and impacts and stuff like that, and see how that affects us very differently in Pittsburgh or someplace like that versus in England, where the Great Atlantic Current is constantly bringing warm water up from the west coast of Africa and bringing very cold polar water down the east coast of the United States. And so completely different dragon habitats, and therefore we absolutely would expect to see different dragon species and so forth. So this is just a chance for us to kind of take a step back and think, okay, so yeah, dragons are cool, but how could they live? So this is part of a broader field of study called dungeon ecology, where the dragons have to poop somewhere. Do they fertilize the forests that they are in, much like, for example, grizzly bears do in Alaska? One of the primary forest soil nutrients is grizzly bear poop. So if you find a huge pile off in your wild explorations out there, make sure it's not dragon poop. You may sort of change the very delicate ecological balance that apex predators like dragons introduce. So what about the body mass square cube rule? There's kind of a truthiness to how dragons move in film and in art. it's got to look pretty good to us, but is that biologically possible? Like, do they have to have bones the strength of steel or greater in order to not shatter themselves from the leverage of a wingspan that could be dozens of meters wide? What examples do we have of homeothermy? So temperature regulation, cold versus hot-blooded dragons. The Hebridean black dragon is habitated just 3 degrees south of the Arctic Circle. And so how does that possibly work with something that we presume is a reptile, right? The Antipodean opal is polarized, sort of that pearlescent or opalescent cast to its skin, and in particular across its eyes. We might examine that as a competitive adaptation to be able to hunt large fish across the sea and be able to see through the glare on the water using, like professional fishermen do, iridium-coated optics and polarized lenses. Baby mandrakes, and as it turns out, a whole lot of tree species scream, although we can't actually hear the trees screaming. They also, according to recent research, communicate intricately over surprisingly large amounts of terrain through mycelium networks. So the fungal colonies that connect roots between individual trees, they use to signal that across back and forth. And of course, we'll talk about, if you want to, Frank Thunderbird from Fantastic Beasts is anisodactyl, which determines a very specific kind of hunting behavior. Binocular for that predatory confocal ability to perceive depth instead of a prey species like a horse, which sees close to 360, but closer to black and white and not in stereo 3D. It is a swallowtail, meaning it can use that physical structure of its tail, that sort of twin tail, to coast very, very energy efficiently. And of course, the Thunderbird, at least in this movie, is octopodal. It has 3 sets of wings and hind legs as well. So now, one kind of a sad question, what about ocean microplastics accumulating in kelpie tissue? I don't know how that works. So whatever you guys would like to talk about, let's do that. But before we get into the discussion portion, we'll introduce Dr. Hayashi, veterinarian to the Magical Stars.
Hey everyone, my name is Emmy, and unlike the amazing intellects that you've just heard discuss some of their research, I am the softer version of science. I am a veterinarian, so I'm interested in presenting information on domestic pets and especially people's familiars. So I think, can you show the next slide, Emily? Many of you probably have a pet of some sort, and as you can see here, this is my husband with his familiar, Paige, and it's very important for people and their companion animals to not only give them a healthy environment, but then also just the emotional and psychological support that they provide for us. I have found that many people ask me questions mostly about cats. I get very few questions about toads and other familiars, so I figured probably at the last conference that we did, every question was about cats. So I figured if we keep this in the realm of cats, that would be totally acceptable, and I hear you. So I'm here to answer those types of questions. Oh, and there is Logan with his familiar on the camera. If you can see him, she's waving hello. So yeah, so we are actually very interested in presenting a array of science, but as you will notice, we're obviously missing many factors here. We have no physics specialists here on our panel, and you can see that we have no Slytherins on our panel. That's unfortunate. So if any of you are in different sciences, and especially if you're a Slytherin, we would love for you to join our panel. Special shout out to Emily Greenwald. She has been the amazing mastermind and coordinator of everything that we have been doing. And we want to open this up to you because we realize that there are so many different aspects of science that people are interested in. So we're going to open the floor and have you ask questions, just kind of directed to individual speakers, and we will go from there.
I just want to give one more shout out to Kate, who actually did a lot of the coordinating this year. And also just want to say that you can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube at Wizard Genes. And we also wanted to make an announcement. Oh no, where is it? Oh no, sorry. Well, we wanted to make an announcement because we know this is located in Pennsylvania to everyone to vote. And we just wanted to take an opportunity to do that. And oh, this is us voting. So this is Emmy voting. This is me voting and my familiar Maisie telling all of you to vote. And so you can go to vote.org to get your voting information. And with that, I think we will open it up to questions. And it looks like there's already a lot in the chat. So
yeah, I actually was going to suggest if I actually can't invite anybody on right now, but Emily can as the host. But you may want to bring in Louise Freeman, who's also a science psychologist and neuroscientist. She might enjoy being a panelist here. Just putting her on the spot. Yep. She was also contributing. Oh, there she is. Also contributing a lot in the chat.
Hi. Well, this was a surprise, but okay. Might have. Okay. Hi. Yes.
I know I had a question which I typed in the chat. I wanted to hear a little bit more about. Well, first of all, my mind was blown by those repeats with the DNA repeats, the 30 and the yeah. Like I actually was like, is this canonical? Like, is this from the books? Is this from Pottermore? And like, no, we just came up with the theory. And I was like, oh my goodness, that's wonderful. So congratulations. That just blew my mind. Yeah.
I should have said this was actually a theory put forth several years ago by a grad student at University of Delaware named Andrea Klenotis. So it's not my theory. It is a theory I agreed with. There are other theories related to, if people are familiar with like chromatin dynamics and epigenetics, which is how DNA is packaged and how that packaging changes how it's expressed. There are theories related to that, but they're not nearly as compelling. So the repeats is actually the same as Huntington's disease, the same mechanism.
Interesting. Yeah, I had read an article online, and actually one of our biology professors here spoke years ago about sort of just a basic inheritance of like, homozygote recessive or something as coming out as being a squib, which I think we're most of us as the Harry Potter scientists probably knew about that, but I did not know about this theory. So yeah, thank you for bringing it up. And I know,
it works much better than just recessive or dominant.
Yes, it does. It works really well. And I don't want to hog the airways, but I did want to hear a little more about tree signaling. That was something I had totally missed as a scientist, and it just blew my mind. So if we could hear a little more about that, Logan, that would I would really appreciate it. And then I'm going to let you guys handle your Q&A.
Okay, so we'll just talk very briefly about organismal signaling, and this is very much a focus of study recently in a couple of different areas. So one of my PhD students is working on an ecoacoustics project, and trees can produce extremely ultrasonic sounds. So it would be like listening to bat chatter, although the periodicity, the frequency of each call is much longer and sort of just kind of drawn out. It doesn't sound like an animal. Plants and motile species alike also signal each other chemically. So for example, with tree pathogens like emerald ash borer, which is working over the United States, things like the pine bark beetles just destroying forests all around the Colorado Front Range and stuff like that with climate warming and stuff like that. Almost immediately the trees will begin signaling each other saying, I'm under attack, something's wrong. And then trees downwind in that case will begin producing defensive compounds, allelopathic compounds, to help try and sort of stave off that particular infection or injury. And then with the mycelium network, so those are the fungal symbiotes that sort of grow around root hairs and nodules to help liberate soil nutrients in a chemical form that can sort of move into the root hair and then get transported up the plant for use. Those fungal networks also are receptive to changes in the tree physiology and actually communicate. And there was one, I just saw this publication earlier this year, one tree community physiologist suggesting that these mycelial networks are actually providing some kind of an economy. Trees will actually allocate resources to each other dynamically according to the needs of each of the organisms, which absolutely is revolutionary in our field of forestry. So that's new, it's coming out, and yeah, that's not even saying anything of what do kelpies deal with in terms of sound pollution in the ocean from transcontinental ocean shipping and not being able to call each other like whales over the course of many, many hundreds of miles in between individuals.
I think we have 2 questions for Emmy in the chat about cats. Or not in the chat, in the Q&A. One is, can you talk about your understanding of Crookshank's role in the arc of the Harry Potter story?
That was an interesting question. I'm not exactly sure which direction you wanted me to go with as it relates to Crookshanks. Crookshanks, for those of you who are unfamiliar, was Hermione's familiar, her cat. And as many of us know, we adore our own personal cats. Many people may have the idea that the cats are isolated animals, that they don't want our company, that they are antisocial, is sometimes the adjectives that are used to describe them. But what I think most people don't realize is that cats are actually very social animals. They actually enjoy being with other cats. Cats take care of other cats. And when you have a cat in your family, they do consider you as part of their family. Now, to understand how they can be standoffish at times, we do have a study that came out of Japan that shows that cats recognize their names, but they do choose to ignore us. So that is actually a true statement, that cats will ignore you if they don't feel like responding to you. I don't know too much more. I might need a little bit more detailed questions about Crookshanks to follow that some more. So what was the second question, Emily?
The second question was, wizards seem to have special connections to their familiars, such as Hedwig or Mrs. Norris. Do you think magic helps? Do the familiars have their own type of magic?
Ooh, that's an interesting question. Do familiars have their own magic? Well, with the way that people can be devoted to their pets, you might argue. I mean, we call that the human-animal bond, and it's for people who have pets. There are some people who may not understand it, like their dog or their cat may just be their dog or cat, but then there are other people who see the human-animal bond at a much higher level, and so these are individuals who would consider their pets to be their familiar. So these are family members, and these are people who go to their veterinarian and they see us as the other family doctor, because their pets are very, very important to them. Every once in a while I'll have a client who will complain saying, oh my goodness, I've spent so much money on this pet. But I like to remind people, fear not, you don't have to pay for a wedding. You don't have to pay for them to go to college. So if you spend a couple $1,000s when they get sick, that may not be the worst situation. Yeah, so, oops. Oh, sorry, I was just reading a comment. So yeah, animals, I think they do have some kind of magic, but it's not the same type of magic as what we see in Harry Potter. I think it's almost an undefined a quality.
So I think we don't have any more questions in the Q&A, but we really do want to hear from you and be able to answer your questions and what you're excited about related to science and Harry Potter. So feel free to put questions in the Q&A. It's a little bit confusing to go through the chat because there's lots of non-question comments. So if you don't mind, if you put something in the chat and I just didn't see it, or someone else has seen a question in the chat that I missed.
Well,
oh, you go ahead, Louise.
Yeah, one thing I think it's really, it's wonderful to see people from so many scientific disciplines represented. And, I think scientists often get a bad rap for, we're not interested in humanities. We're not interested in all that fictional stuff and
stuff.
We're such technocrats. But one talk I've given very frequently in the Harry Potter festival community is one on scientific names for new species that come from Harry Potter. I know I've given that at Chestnut Hill. And every time I do it, I have to make it longer, because I started off, I think, with 5, and now we're up to at least 12. And these are scientists who discover new species of snake or spiders or crabs or whatever, and name them for Harry Potter characters. And I think that's a very cool representation of this synergy between science and Harry Potter.
If I can tag on to Louise's comment there, the Potter wizarding fandom actually has a specific set of references to taxonomy. So naming and classifying different kinds of organisms, and Linnaean binary names like the Latin names ratus, ratus, stuff like that, Homo sapiens. They make distinctions of beings and kinds, and monsters and non-monsters. And it's interesting to see kind of another taxonomic structure that kind of maps onto what we understand sort of as regular folks with classifying species. Now it's done on genetic distance. I mean, there are dozens of different taxonomic techniques and structures that are kind of exclusive to each other. And it's fascinating for me as a scientist to see how some of science is very sort of objective, cut and dried, empirical. This is what I measured. This is the graph that shows it. And other parts of it are still very much in debate, in flux. And it's a lot of fun to just keep a finger on that pulse, like our dragons, for example. Are they different species of dragons? Can they interbreed, or are they just different breeds or kinds? Like they can all intermingle with each other, no problem. So I'll shut up so we can get out this nice list of questions now. Rock and roll.
Yeah. Well, Hagrid seems to be pretty good at breeding very different species from each other when he makes, blast-ended screws. So maybe magical creatures aren't bound by interspecies breeding as much.
So I see one of the questions in the question thing is about why Pensieve memories are not used in Wizard Court. And that is actually a really good question. I had not thought about that. Why don't they, if they're trying to charge someone with something, why don't they just take their memory and see if they committed a crime or not? That's actually a really good question. I suppose that does raise some ethical dilemmas possibly that I don't necessarily feel qualified to talk about so much, but I suppose if they really don't ever use Pensieve memories for like eyewitness testimony or anything like that, maybe that would suggest that it's not always 100% accurate. Maybe the memory, even the ones that you put in the Pensieve, does degrade a little, and that maybe why they don't rely on it so much. But I don't know. It really seems like at least Dumbledore's use of Pensieve, he seems to rely pretty heavily on the quality of his memories, but maybe Dumbledore has a better memory than the rest of us. I'm not sure, but that's a really great question. I love that question. So, if anyone else has thoughts about it, let me know.
Maybe there's a Fifth Amendment type of issue too, where
maybe.
There's a law to use your own memory against you in the court of law, so any guilty person wouldn't let their memory be used.
Yeah, maybe. That's actually a really good point. Maybe there is.
So there's a question here about gene expression in grasshoppers versus locusts. I know nothing about bugs. I really don't like bugs, so I don't know. But the question about metamorph magi's different gene expression locus or different locus, I think, yeah, that's a really good one. So there are actually a bunch of secondary wizarding characteristics that depend on someone being a wizard, so having magical abilities such as Parseltongue, metamorph magi, the gift of the inner eye or the gift of sight. These seem to be inherited in different ways, but in order for them to be observed or to happen at all, it seems that they need to have the wizarding locus first. So it's sort of like a secondary characteristic, potentially controlled by, okay, you have the wizarding locus, you have magical abilities, and maybe there's a region of it that can control other genetic regions or interact with their expression in certain ways. And if you don't have that as a transcription factor locus, you can't have the secondary characteristic. We have another question. If there are fundamental aspects of how the world works for which we currently have no conceptual tools to grasp, what are the changes of new domains of understanding approximating something closer to magic? I think this sounds like it's maybe a question for Andrew, our
I'd also be interested in this as well. Andrew?
Yeah, I'm not totally sure if this is a question about something in the real world, a development in the real world that we have no conceptual tools to grasp. Certainly, we might label as magic. There's that quote that what is it? New technology is magic. I'm messing this quote up, but right. I mean, when you don't understand how new technologies work, it seems like it's magical. I was thinking that the tree example sounds like magic. I imagine if you asked people, do trees communicate? They'd say, no way. And like, that just sounds like an impossibility because we think of trees as inert. So here's like real world interactions, processes that would get labeled as magical because they're beyond our conceptual understanding. If perhaps this question was about whether like the magical world itself could lead to new ways of understanding, my guess is that you wouldn't see a lot of that surviving in fiction because so much of fiction, crafting the fiction, is to resonate with what the audience's intuitions and understanding. So if an author wanted to create like a magical hierarchy that was counterintuitive, I don't think that the narrative would flow in the right ways, and it probably just wouldn't sell well or resonate with audiences.
If I could jump in here, I know Emily said that the one sort of area of science that's lacking from this panel, which is pretty extensive, I applaud I applaud you all, is physics. And so I read this question from Jude as, what happens when the data that you're acquiring starts to bump up to the limits of your modeling? And so I was immediately thinking of like Newton, the idea of an asymptote, the idea of approaching, for example, approaching zero but never getting there. And so calculus, the whole field of calculus had to be created to deal with this idea. Or more recently with, the quantum revolution, that you had, Niels Bohr and Heisenberg, struggling with this uncertainty principle at the quantum level. And ultimately from that came matrix mathematics, which allows for this uncertainty, right? It gives us a mathematical model to be able to put uncertainty into our equation and get the correct prediction, which ultimately is a part of what science is about. And so I would argue that just saying something's magical, this is sort of a bold statement, but saying something's magical just means we haven't pushed far enough into research and development of scientific theory. Now, I have this argument with my students all the time. There are certainly areas where scientists do not belong. I would not want a scientist to define love or beauty or things like this. I mean, I don't want love reduced to similar triangles or beauty or attractiveness reduced to like a neurotransmitter or a smell. I mean, come on, there's more to life than what is scientifically quantifiable. However, I would say that what we've seen in the history of science is that we develop models as we get new data, and we're constantly pushing that boundary forward. And evolution, I think, Darwin is another great idea of this, these leaps forward in scientific understanding.
I want to add a question because actually my undergrad degree is in public health. So I wanted to ask a question for Ariel about what makes dragonpox different, and how do you think public health officials would handle diseases like dragonpox and spatter groit in the Wizarding World?
Very interesting. So how is it different from like Muggle diseases?
Yeah, their ability to control Muggles diseases versus those.
Gotcha. Yeah. So in terms of like the physiology and like the clinical aspects of it, like I, as an epidemiologist, would not understand that. In terms of how, magical epidemiologists would address like, contagion and spread, I would think that they would employ some similar techniques that we're seeing now in terms of like public health approaches to infectious diseases. I read actually a really cool theory. I forget where I read this. It was somewhere on like Twitter where they were saying Aurors may be taught and trained to be contact tracers. And so, maybe they're doing some sort of, a bit more magical than like calling people and asking like where they have been. I don't think that Hogwarts would shut down, if they survived like a basilisk. I think they're just probably sending kids to Madame Pomfrey. But yeah, I think they're definitely not using like R and Stata and like cranking out statistics. I think they're cheating, but getting ahead of what we're doing. But yeah.
Awesome, thanks.
I just have to say, I was typing in a little bit of a partial answer to Charlotte Picard's question, and it got pushed over from open to answered, and I did not intend that. So Emily, if you don't mind looking also at the bottom of the answered list, or I can just read it. Charlotte Picard, based on the DNA theories Emily mentioned, could it be possible to encounter situations where the individual magical characteristic stands somewhere between wizard and squib formal categories? For example, like Neville kind of taking a little longer to develop. And I had just snuck in there, like maybe there's a puberty component a la the X-Men, but I'm gonna let other people here answer this.
Oh, that's hilarious. I like the puberty idea. So the way it works in Huntington's disease is actually higher. So this is also explained by the same theory of triple repeat expansion. Higher number of repeats leads to significantly more severe disease. So for example, like if you have a disease model, so I worked on Huntington's briefly in flies. If you have a disease model of like several hundred repeats, the flies can't even survive to adulthood stages or like young adulthood stages in flies. And so the more repeats you have, the more severe disease would be. So that if we place that onto magical abilities, the more repeats you have, the more powerful of a mage you are. And so in the case of Harry, he's very, very powerful. We know his parents were very, very powerful. And so they probably had a really high number of repeats. And then in the case of, for example, Fred and George or the Patil twins, they have comparable magical abilities. And so that's probably because of the number of repeats. In Neville's case, it's slightly unusual because we know his parents were exceptionally powerful, and it did take him some time to show the disease, not to show the disease phenotype, to show the magical phenotype. But it's possible he had just like slightly lower number of repeats, but then once he did showcase his magical abilities, they came on really strong. And also that's the case with Huntington's. This disease progression happens faster with higher repeats as well. So
I was also thinking that maybe because we know he had a pretty traumatizing childhood as well, at least in part. I was wondering if maybe in the same way that in cases of kids with trauma, sometimes development is delayed, maybe it's sort of similar thing. Maybe he just needed a little more time. Not that Harry didn't also have a very traumatizing childhood, so I guess it's not really the same, but just a thought.
Can I comment on something? It's in the chat. Jude Jones wrote, I've always taken magic in the books as a metaphor for agency. And I really like that because in my own work, I've been thinking about magic as equivalent to impossibility, but it's so much magic in Harry Potter and beyond is doing things that humans can do. Maybe it's magical because it's done instantaneously or without like contact causality, but I think there is this dimension of showing that some characters do have more agency than others for one reason or another. So that's really a different psychological perspective on the appearance, the use of magic in fiction.
Yes, I was just typing into the chat here that unfortunately we're getting a little towards the end of our time, but I don't want to cut it off because we're having such a great conversation. Emily or any of the other panelists, do you have any one last question that you would want to address, or should we just hope that we'll all be able to contact each other after we end the panel?
Why don't we all put our contact information in the chat, and then also if you contact me at Wizard Genes on Twitter, Facebook, or I think the other one I have, and I have the Gmail, we can disseminate the questions as well because we'd love to keep hearing from you all.
That is fantastic. I'm going to leave the chat. I'm actually going to leave this open. I'm not going to close out Zoom, just so that we can all take a look at the questions and we can jot down the email addresses that we need. And I have to admit, we have Tim Jennings, who does our social media I actually don't have a Twitter account. I'm sorry. It would have been much easier to be able to just get it out to everybody. But I just wanted to thank you all on behalf of the conference, but also on behalf of the all of the action that's happening in the chat here. I mean, this has been the kind of panel that I've been waiting 9 years for. It's the ninth year of the conference, and it's really exciting to me to have you all here. I'm so happy that you put in the proposal and that I got to be here as well. But this was amazing. So thank you so much. And I would just give everybody a little bit of a heads up for tomorrow. Remember, you have a different set of Zoom links, unfortunately. We found a little issue with Zoom. They don't let you register people if you have your webinar happening over multiple sessions. So we had to do a separate Zoom links for the Raven Room and the Griffin Room tomorrow. We have a little bit later of a start time to give us a little bit extra sleep on a Saturday. The rooms open at 8:45 a.m. The welcome is at 9:15, and the first talk is at 9:30. In the Griffin Room, it'll be Textual Analyses Part 2. And here in the Raven Room, Harry Potter and Psychology, of which we will be welcoming Louise Freeman back again. So yes, we're really looking forward to seeing you all tomorrow in the Griffin Room and the Raven Room. And of course, we're looking forward to our last featured speaker, Dr. Christopher Bell, who's speaking on Harry Potter and identity, basically revisioning Harry Potter as a Black character, which is really going to be great. So I will hope to see you all tomorrow in the Griffin Room or the Raven Room. And I think I'm going to switch over to our video just so we can all see the chat for a little bit longer. But have a really good night, guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
Definitely.
So many good questions, so little time.